Sheriff Jake Harrison never imagined that enforcing the law would lead him to the altar with the very woman whose wanted poster hung in his office. When notorious outlaw Sarah Black Rose Mackenzie was captured after a failed bank robbery in the dusty town of Millbrook, Texas, the year was 1887, and justice moved swift as a rattlesnake strike. But fate had other plans, and what started as a desperate legal maneuver would unravel secrets that had been buried beneath the desert sand for over a decade. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street when Jake received the telegram that would change everything. Sarah Mackenzie was to hang within 3 days unless extraordinary circumstances arose. Little did anyone know that extraordinary was exactly what Millbrook was about to witness. Judge Patterson had discovered an obscure territorial law stating that a condemned woman could escape execution if she married a man of good standing who would take responsibility for her actions. It was a law written by desperate legislators trying to populate the frontier, but it had never been tested until that fateful August morning. Jake Harrison was 32 years old, a man carved from the harsh landscape of West Texas. His weathered hands had drawn his Colt .45 more times than he cared to count, and his steel-gray eyes had seen enough violence to age him beyond his years. He had become sheriff of Millbrook after the previous lawman was gunned down by the infamous Dalton gang, and Jake had sworn to bring order to a town that seemed to attract trouble like honey draws flies. The irony that he would soon be bound to one of the most wanted criminals in 3 territories was not lost on him, but duty came before personal comfort, and Jake had always been a man of duty. Sarah Mackenzie was 26 when she first saw the inside of Millbrook's jail, but her reputation preceded her like smoke before fire. Known throughout Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona as the Black Rose, she had earned her nickname not from any romantic notion, but from her habit of leaving a single black rose on the bodies of those who crossed her. She was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, with raven black hair that caught the light like silk and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets deeper than any mine shaft. But beauty was just another weapon in her arsenal, and she had used it to devastating effect across the American Southwest. The first hook that would capture the attention of anyone who heard this tale was the sheer impossibility of what happened next. When Judge Patterson presented the marriage option to both parties, the entire town of Millbrook gathered outside the courthouse, certain they were about to witness either a hanging or the most unlikely wedding in territorial history. Sarah's response was immediate and shocking. She accepted without hesitation, but her reasons remained as mysterious as her past. Jake's decision took longer, tormented by the knowledge that he would be yoking himself to a woman who had killed at least 7 men and robbed more banks than anyone could accurately count. The wedding ceremony took place at sunset on August 15th. With half the town serving as witnesses and the other half placing bets on how long the marriage would last before one spouse killed the other. Reverend Thomas McCall performed the service with shaking hands, fully expecting to be conducting a funeral within the week. Sarah wore a simple blue dress borrowed from the general store owner's daughter, while Jake stood rigid in his best Sunday clothes, his badge gleaming against the dark fabric of his coat. Neither smiled during the exchange of vows, and when the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, the kiss they shared was brief and cold as a winter morning. What nobody expected was what happened during their first night as husband and wife. Sarah, now legally Sarah Harrison, was released into Jake's custody, and he brought her to his modest home on the outskirts of town. The house was simple but clean, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room that reflected the practical nature of its owner. Jake had prepared for the worst, sleeping with his gun under his pillow and one eye open, but Sarah surprised him by asking for nothing more than a cup of coffee and permission to sit on the front porch and watch the stars. As they sat in uncomfortable silence, Sarah began to speak, and what she revealed would shake the very foundations of everything Jake thought he knew about justice, law, and the woman he had just married. She told him about the night her family was murdered, how she had hidden in the root cellar while bandits killed her parents and younger brother, and how she had emerged to find their bodies scattered like broken dolls across the farmhouse floor. The bandits had worn badges, she said, lawmen who were supposed to protect people like her family, but who had instead taken everything she loved and left her with nothing but hatred and a thirst for revenge. The second hook in this incredible story came with Sarah's revelation that she had spent the last 8 years hunting down the men who had destroyed her family, and that 3 of them were still alive. More shocking still was her claim that one of those men was living right there in Millbrook, hiding behind a respectable facade while she had been planning his downfall. Jake's first instinct was disbelief, but something in Sarah's voice, a quality of absolute certainty mixed with barely contained fury, made him listen more carefully than he had ever listened to anything in his life. Over the following days, Sarah began to reveal the true scope of her mission. The bank robberies, she explained, had been carefully selected targets, each one connected to the network of corrupt lawmen who had murdered her family. The money she had stolen had been traced back to illegal activities, and she had been redistributing it to families who had been cheated or harmed by these same men. The 7 men she had killed were all part of the same conspiracy, a web of corruption that stretched across multiple territories and involved judges, sheriffs, and businessmen who used their positions to prey on innocent settlers. Jake found himself in an impossible position. As sheriff, he was sworn to uphold the law, but the woman he had married was describing a system of justice that had failed so completely that she had been forced to create her own. Every instinct told him to dismiss her claims as the desperate lies of a criminal trying to justify her actions. But Sarah began producing evidence that was impossible to ignore. From her saddlebags, she pulled out documents, photographs, and correspondence that painted a picture of corruption, so extensive that Jake began to understand why she had chosen to work outside the law. The man Sarah claimed was living in Millbrook under a false identity was none other than Deputy Marshal William Crawford, a respected lawman who had arrived in town 6 months earlier claiming to be investigating territorial boundary disputes. Sarah had been tracking him for 3 years, following a trail that had led her through Colorado, Utah, and finally to Texas. She had planned to kill him the night before her bank robbery arrest, but circumstances had forced her to accelerate her timeline, leading to the botched robbery that had landed her in jail. As Jake digested this information, he realized that his new wife was either the most elaborate liar he had ever encountered, or she was telling the truth about a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The evidence she presented was compelling, but it also placed him in mortal danger. If Sarah was right, then William Crawford was a killer who would stop at nothing to protect his secret identity, and Jake's marriage to the woman hunting him made the sheriff a target as well. The mystery deepened when Jake began his own investigation into Crawford's background. Using his authority as sheriff, he sent telegrams to various territorial offices, requesting information about the deputy marshal's previous assignments. What he discovered was troubling. Crawford's official record was remarkably clean, almost suspiciously so, with commendations from every posting and not a single complaint or incident report. But when Jake looked deeper, he found gaps in Crawford's timeline that corresponded exactly with the dates Sarah had given him for her family's murder and the subsequent killings she claimed he had committed. Meanwhile, Crawford seemed to be watching the newly married couple with unusual interest. He began finding excuses to visit Jake's office more frequently, asking questions about Sarah's background and expressing concern about the sheriff's safety. Jake noticed that Crawford always seemed to appear whenever Sarah ventured into town, his hand never far from his gun and his eyes tracking her every movement like a predator watching prey. The tension in Millbrook was becoming palpable, and Jake realized that his marriage had set events in motion that could only end in violence. Sarah, for her part, seemed almost relieved to finally have someone who might believe her story. She began sharing details about her hunt that revealed a methodical intelligence that Jake had not expected from someone he had initially dismissed as a common criminal. She had spent years learning to read, write, and research, teaching herself skills that had allowed her to track her quarry across thousands of miles of hostile territory. Her bank robberies had been carefully planned operations designed to fund her mission while gathering intelligence about the men she hunted. The first major twist in their story came when Jake discovered that Sarah's family had not been random victims. Her father, Thomas Mackenzie, had been a territorial surveyor who had discovered evidence of massive land fraud involving several prominent officials. The Mackenzie family had been killed not for money or supplies, but because Thomas had stumbled upon documents that could have brought down some of the most powerful men in the territory. Sarah had these documents, hidden in a place that only she knew, and they represented the final piece of evidence needed to expose the entire conspiracy. As Jake learned more about his wife's true mission, he found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could fulfill his duty as sheriff by turning Sarah over to the territorial authorities, knowing that she would likely be executed and that the truth about her family's murder would die with her. Or he could join her in her quest for justice, abandoning everything he had believed about law and order in favor of a more personal and dangerous kind of righteousness. The decision was complicated by his growing realization that Sarah was not the cold-blooded killer her reputation suggested, but rather a woman driven by grief and a desperate need to see justice done. The situation reached a breaking point when Crawford made his move. One evening, as Jake was making his rounds, the deputy marshal cornered Sarah outside the general store. He offered her a deal: disappear forever, and he would ensure that Jake was not harmed. Refuse, and both she and her new husband would suffer the same fate as her family. Sarah's response was to pull the small derringer she had hidden in her boot and put a bullet through Crawford's hat, missing his head by inches. The message was clear, but it also meant that subterfuge was no longer possible. Crawford's retaliation was swift and vicious. He sent a telegram to the territorial capital claiming that Sheriff Harrison was harboring a known criminal and possibly collaborating with her gang. Within days, a detachment of territorial marshals was riding toward Millbrook with orders to arrest both Jake and Sarah. But Sarah had anticipated this move, and she revealed to Jake that she had allies, other victims of the conspiracy who had been working in secret to gather evidence and protect witnesses. The network she had built over 8 years of hunting was about to prove its worth. The climax of their story began when the territorial marshals arrived in Millbrook, led by a man Sarah recognized as another member of the conspiracy that had killed her family. Marshal Robert Hendricks had been Crawford's superior during the years when the corrupt lawmen had been operating with impunity, and his presence confirmed Sarah's worst fears about how deep the corruption ran. Jake realized that surrendering to these men would be tantamount to signing their death warrants, and for the first time in his career, he made the decision to resist lawful authority. The final confrontation took place in the desert outside Millbrook, where Jake and Sarah had retreated with the evidence that could expose the conspiracy. They were outnumbered 4-1, but Sarah had chosen the location carefully, using her knowledge of the terrain to even the odds. The gunfight that followed was brief but decisive, with Jake discovering that his new wife was as deadly with a rifle as she was beautiful. When the smoke cleared, Crawford and 2 of the marshals were dead, while Hendricks lay dying in the sand, finally confessing to his crimes as his life ebbed away. The resolution of their story came not through violence, but through the power of the evidence Sarah had spent years collecting. The documents her father had died protecting, combined with the testimonies of other victims and the confession of Marshal Hendricks, were enough to bring down the entire network of corrupt officials. Jake and Sarah traveled to the territorial capital, where they presented their case to Governor Samuel Mitchell, a man whose own investigation into territorial corruption had been stymied by lack of evidence. The governor's response was immediate and sweeping. Within weeks, arrest warrants were issued for dozens of officials across multiple territories, and a complete reorganization of the territorial law enforcement system was announced. Jake was offered a position as territorial marshal, while Sarah was granted a full pardon for her crimes, with the understanding that her actions had been taken in pursuit of justice that the system had failed to provide. The Black Rose was officially dead, but Sarah Harrison was very much alive. The epilogue to their remarkable story found Jake and Sarah settling into their marriage with a foundation built on truth and shared purpose rather than legal necessity. They remained in Millbrook, where Jake continued as sheriff while Sarah used her skills as a researcher to help other victims of injustice navigate the legal system. Their relationship, which had begun as a desperate expedient, grew into something deeper and more meaningful than either had expected. They had found in each other not just a partner, but someone who understood that sometimes justice requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things, even when it means standing against the very system they had sworn to serve. The years that followed brought changes to Millbrook that nobody could have anticipated when Jake Harrison first pinned on his sheriff's badge. The corruption scandal that Sarah's evidence had exposed sent shockwaves through the entire territorial government, leading to reforms that would eventually help pave the way for Arizona and New Mexico statehood. But for the people of Millbrook, the most remarkable transformation was watching the relationship between their sheriff and his outlaw bride evolve from a marriage of legal convenience into something that resembled the great love stories their grandchildren would read about in dime novels. Sarah's transition from the feared Black Rose to Sarah Harrison, respected citizen of Millbrook, was not without its challenges. Many townspeople remained suspicious of her, whispering behind their hands about the woman who had once terrorized half the Southwest. But Sarah seemed determined to prove that people could change, that the circumstances that had driven her to violence were behind her forever. She opened a small office above the general store, offering her services as a letter writer and legal researcher for settlers who couldn't read or write. Her years of tracking corrupt officials had made her surprisingly knowledgeable about territorial law, and she used these skills to help honest people navigate a system that had previously seemed designed to exploit them. Jake found himself falling in love with his wife gradually, the way dawn creeps across the desert. It started with small moments of recognition, times when he would catch Sarah staring out at the horizon with an expression of deep sadness, and he would understand that she was thinking about the family she had lost. Or when she would unconsciously reach for the gun that was no longer on her hip, her instincts still sharp from years of living in constant danger. He began to see past the legend of the Black Rose to the woman underneath, someone who had endured unimaginable loss and had somehow managed to retain her capacity for kindness despite everything she had been through. The first time Jake told Sarah he loved her was on a cold December evening in 1888, more than a year after their strange wedding. They were sitting by the fireplace in their home, Sarah mending one of his shirts while he cleaned his guns. A domestic scene that would have been impossible to imagine when she was still wearing shackles in his jail cell. The words came out quietly, almost accidentally, but Sarah's response was immediate and surprising. She set down her sewing, looked him directly in the eyes, and told him that she had been in love with him since the night he had chosen to believe her story instead of dismissing her as a liar and a killer. Their second wedding took place the following spring, this time with Sarah wearing a white dress she had sewn herself and Jake grinning like a schoolboy throughout the entire ceremony. The same Reverend McCall who had married them the first time performed the service, though his hands no longer shook, and this time the kiss they shared at the altar lasted long enough to make some of the congregation blush. The town of Millbrook threw a celebration that lasted 3 days, with even Sarah's former detractors admitting that the woman who had once been the territory's most wanted criminal had become one of their most valued citizens. The mystery of Sarah's past revealed one final surprise in the summer of 1889, when a young man rode into Millbrook claiming to be her brother. Daniel Mackenzie had been away at boarding school in St. Louis when their family was murdered, and he had spent years believing that his entire family was dead. When news of the corruption scandal and Sarah's role in exposing it reached the eastern newspapers, Daniel had recognized his sister's maiden name and had come west to find her. The reunion between the siblings was emotional beyond description, with Sarah weeping openly for the first time since Jake had known her. Daniel decided to stay in Millbrook, taking a job at the bank and eventually becoming one of Jake's deputies. As the 1890s dawned, Jake and Sarah Harrison had become something of a legend throughout the Southwest, though not for the reasons either of them would have expected. Their story had been picked up by newspaper writers and dime novel authors, who had transformed their unlikely romance into a tale of redemption and true love that captured the imagination of readers across the country. Sarah found this attention embarrassing, particularly when the stories bore little resemblance to the truth. But Jake took a certain pride in being known as the man who had tamed the Black Rose through love rather than violence. The couple never had children of their own, a source of quiet sadness that they rarely discussed but that those closest to them understood. Instead, they became unofficial guardians to many of the orphaned and abandoned children who seemed to gravitate toward frontier towns. Their home became known as a place where any child could find a hot meal and a safe place to sleep, and Sarah's fierce protectiveness extended to these surrogate children with the same intensity she had once reserved for hunting her family's killers. Jake would often joke that Sarah had simply traded one type of family for another, though he said it with the kind of love and admiration that made it clear he wouldn't have things any other way. The final chapter of their extraordinary story began in 1895, when Jake received an offer to become the territorial marshal for Arizona, a position that would have meant leaving Millbrook and the life they had built together. Sarah encouraged him to take the job, arguing that his experience and integrity were exactly what the territory needed as it prepared for statehood. But Jake surprised everyone, including his wife, by declining the offer. He told the territorial governor that Millbrook was his home, and that some things were more important than career advancement. Besides, he added with a grin, he had learned that the most dangerous criminals could sometimes be found in the most unexpected places, and somebody needed to keep an eye on his wife. As our story draws to a close, it's worth reflecting on what made Jake and Sarah Harrison's marriage so remarkable. In an era when most marriages were practical arrangements designed to provide economic security and social respectability, theirs had begun as something even more calculated, a legal maneuver designed to cheat the hangman's noose. But what had started as mutual necessity had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than either had dared to hope for. They had found in each other not just love, but understanding, partnership, and the kind of absolute trust that can only exist between people who have faced life and death together. Sarah never completely shed her reputation as the Black Rose, and there were always those who whispered that a woman who had killed 7 men could never truly be reformed. But those who knew her best understood that she had never needed to be reformed, only given a chance to be the person she had always been underneath the pain and anger. Jake had seen that person from the beginning, even when she was sitting in his jail cell planning her escape, and his faith in her had proven to be one of the most important decisions of his life. On quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and they sat together on their front porch watching the sun set over the Texas desert, Jake and Sarah Harrison looked like any other long-married couple enjoying the peace of their later years. But those who knew their story understood that they were looking at something much rarer than ordinary contentment. They were witnesses to a love story that had begun with a noose and a desperate legal gambit, and had somehow transformed into proof that even in the harsh and unforgiving world of the American frontier, redemption and genuine happiness were possible for those brave enough to reach for them. The sheriff and the outlaw had found something that neither law nor lawlessness could provide alone. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had discovered that sometimes the most important justice is the kind that allows people to become who they were always meant to be. In the end, that might be the most extraordinary thing of all about the marriage that began as a sentence of death and became instead a celebration of life, love, and the infinite possibility of second chances.